Alexandros. Alexandros is extremely hardy. It's very hard to kill him. He is one of the only two characters that I'm aware of that are both magical and armored, meaning he takes less damage from magical attacks and physical attacks. That can make him really hard to kill. He is also a tank. If you look for his hero tokens, he's usually very difficult to get a hold of. You can only get tokens from either heroic or the great summon. So there's nothing on the honor summons, and for the great summons, you can only get tokens for him. You can't unlock him as a character. You can only build up tokens to unlock him. So heroic is the only one that you can actually unlock him entirely and then also build up tokens for him. So fairly difficult to get. He was one of the last characters that I picked up. If we look at his stats real quick, he's obviously the light type, but there he has the magical and armored traits. He has incredibly high defense. I think he's the second highest defense of all the characters in the game. His health is actually just moderate to high. He doesn't have an extremely high amount of health. And then, as you'd expect for this type of character, relatively low attack and skill values. Kind of scan down his resistances. You see that lightning resist as expected. And his abilities. He's got his regular attack and damage reflection, which is, again, the first thing that really makes him interesting as a character. What you can see here is that you actually gain 1 additional percent of damage taken that's transferred back to the attacker for every 2 levels that you upgrade the skill. So presumably, it starts at 20%. So if you get him all the way up to 60 or 61, then you'd get 30% from that, adding that to the original 20%. When the skill's maxed out, you could reflect 50% of the damage. One of the nice things about this is that it scales with the opponent's damage, which is useful, so that it's not going to become obsolete at any time. This will scale nicely. The only downside is that it's not super useful in a lot of PvP fighting. It may be more helpful when it's up at higher levels, especially as a defender. So far, when I've seen him on defending teams, and he doesn't come up all that often, he hasn't presented much of a threat. He's just not doing a whole lot. The moderate damage reflection wasn't causing all that much trouble for the team. I've had him use the skill and then use polar pounding. On my side, I've used polar pounding on the defenders, and it didn't take too much damage away from Igorok. It would be interesting to run some tests to see if it's actually doing a true percentage like this, or if that number is then acted on by their own defense. If there's some way that this damage is then reduced. So I think some further testing is needed here, but in how I've seen it used so far, it hasn't been all that useful. The thing that would make this much more useful, and actually makes a little more sense for this type of character, would be if this skill was for damage reduction instead of reflection. That would make him a much more useful character, especially considering it's difficult to get him, it's difficult to increase his star level. Making him that kind of top-end defender that really helps out the whole team but doesn't do a lot of damage would be an interesting addition for that type of character. If we look at his next ascension, you see he gets the shield bash that has a high chance of daze, and that's going to continue to go up. It looks like that would be a moderate attack here that appears to be single person. Some of these are misleading though, so we'll have to wait until we get that up to confirm. And then shocking grasp, so a chance to shock on any crit that he does, which would be helpful, but again, not really overwhelming. It shouldn't be too hard to get him that next level up. One thing I thought was interesting, this Evo is, a lot of these are actually called Celestial Evos just as a whole. They'll have different names individually, and they kind of fall under the blanket name of Celestial Evos. But this one is actually called Celestial Evo itself, so that's a little bit different. But overall, I don't see him used very often in either offensive parties for PvP or defensive parties. He'd be much more useful for bosses in the campaign, again, if he had damage reduction instead of damage reflection. And I really think I'm suspicious that that reflection doesn't do a true damage reflection, that there's some modifier that further drops it down just based on my experience with him. And if anyone has any information on that or has done some testing, please leave it in the comments. So I don't see him having a great use, even though he was kind of an interesting character to get a hold of. It's possible once we're able to max out levels and that damage reflection is up to 50%, then he might become much more useful then. In the lower percentages, it doesn't seem to make a big difference.